Hi, I'm Charles Duhigg. I'm really disappointed we can't all be together, but it's probably healthier for us not to be. But nonetheless, I'm really pleased and honored to be here and talking with you. And what I wanted to talk about today was the science of habit formation and the science of productivity. Because I know that many of you have built this amazing company by focusing on being unusually productive. And this gets to something that, as a reporter for New Yorker magazine and as the author of The Power of Habit and Smarter, Faster, Better, I've spent my career trying to understand why are some people and companies more productive than others. And so about 5 years ago, I started this research project where I went to scientists who study productivity and I asked them this basic question. And I'll be honest, before I went in, I had this basic hypothesis. My hypothesis was that the most productive people are people who manage to recognize that there's so much information out there that surrounds them all the time that in order to be productive, they need to build walls to keep that information out so that they can focus on what matters the most. And I'd bring my theory to these researchers and I'd ask them what they think, and they would say, that's a really interesting theory, and it is totally and completely wrong. What they said was, the people who are most productive, they do not build walls to keep out information. Rather, what they do is they realize two critical things. First of all, that our brains, while amazing organs, evolved in a very different setting, right? If you, a millennia ago, were able to multitask, you were king of the hill. If you could look for predators and plant crops at the same time, you had a huge advantage over your neighbor who could only look for predators or only plant crops. And yet we all know that starting in about the 1980s, the ability to multitask was no longer a strength. It started to become a liability. Very often, the people who multitask the most were the least productive. And so what the people who are most productive realize is another big insight, which is that being able to think more deeply, teaching yourself habits that allow you to think more deeply, particularly when thinking is hard, is the ultimate advantage. It is the ultimate productivity hack. And that what researchers have found is that those people who can do so, who understand how their brain works and understand how to build habits that allow them to think more deeply, what psychologists refer to as cognitive routines, those people can expose themselves to much more information and can pick and choose what really matters. And what I want to talk about today is 3 cognitive routines in particular. I want to talk about the routines behind innovation and why some people are more innovative than others. And the routines behind focus, why some people seem to remain focused and avoid the distractions of life. And finally, how we can apply this to self-regulation, how we create the mental habits that allow us to have the willpower to succeed. And to begin, let me start by talking about innovation and tell you the story behind West Side Story. Now, many of you probably know West Side Story, right? The musical. You might have performed in it in high school. What's fascinating to me about the story behind West Side Story is that it actually starts 9 years before the musical premiered, and the premiere was in 1959. In the early 1950s, these 3 guys, Arthur Lawrence, Leonard Bernstein, and Jerome Robbins, or Jerry Robbins, got together with this brand new idea. They had this goal, which is to bring the avant-garde to Broadway. And in order to do that, what they said was, we want to create a musical that is so new, that is so fresh, that nobody's ever heard it before. So for the next 5, 6, 7 years, they write a script. Now, there are only 3 copies of the original script of West Side Story in existence. One of them is at the New York Public Library. And when you go in and you ask to see it, they make you put on these white gloves and they take away all your pens and pencils, but they don't take away your smartphone. So as soon as the librarian leaves, you can take photos of each page as long as nobody finds out that you've ever done it. And what's interesting is if you look at the original script of West Side Story, a script, by the way, that's never been staged, what you notice is this. On the 3rd page of the original script of West Side Story, there's a character who says Frabba Jabba. A couple of minutes later, there's another character who says Cracko Jacko. This is actually the first time that the phrase Cracko Jacko appears in print. In their ambition to create something new and innovative, these guys actually created an entirely new language. And what's interesting is that that's not the only new thing that they did. At the time when they were writing West Side Story, most Americans actually knew about gangs, right? And if you'll remember, the story of West Side Story is that it's about gangs living on the west side of New York. There's the Sharks and the Jets. most Americans were actually familiar with gangs. There was a cliched language about gang life in America because there were these dime store novels that were really, really popular. The same way that all of us think that we understand the mafia because we've seen The Sopranos or the Godfather movies, most Americans thought that they understood gang lifestyle. And so the creators of West Side Story, these three guys, they draw some of the cliches out of that to populate their script. And there's another cliched language that they're also using. Jerry Robbins, the choreographer, he had been trained in classical dance. He had performed in the Nutcracker and in Swan Lake. He knew this visual cliched vocabulary of movement, about how to express emotions on a stage. And he drew on that in coming up with the choreography for West Side Story. So they had this amazing new script that they had written with this made-up vocabulary that drew on these stories of gang lifestyle that most Americans were familiar with and used this choreography, this language of dance that most people knew. And 3 weeks before the play was supposed to premiere, Jerry Robbins turns to his colleagues and says, "Guys, I think we have made a terrible mistake. Because in our ambition to do something new and creative, we have been so wildly original, I don't think anyone's going to understand what's going on. We have gang members on a stage saying things like Frabba Jabba and Cracko Jacko, and I just don't think the audience is going to buy that that's what gang members say." So he said, "Look, let me take another stab at this." Now they had based West Side Story on Romeo and Juliet. And he says, "I have this theory. My theory is that if we can take more cliches, if we can jam more cliches into the script, it'll make it more familiar to people and they'll like it even more." So for 3 weeks, he rewrites everything. They work with their actors to learn whole new lines and whole new dance routines. And 3 weeks later, the premiere is set. Now imagine for a minute, you're sitting in the audience at the premiere of West Side Story. You're the kind of person who comes to Broadway premieres. So you probably have seen 10 musicals in the last year. You've seen 20 ballets. The curtain goes up, and this is what you see. You see these actors walk onto the stage, but they don't look like actors. They look like teenagers. They're dressed like normal teenagers. They're dressed like the teenagers that you saw outside on the street, but they don't move like teenagers. Instead, they move like this. And as you're watching them move, you think to yourself, gosh, that looks really familiar. In fact, this right here, that looks like Swan Lake. And that's a ronde de triomphe. That's this way of showing ownership and possession of a stage that I've seen dozens of times in ballets. And then the story starts to unfold. And you recognize it. You recognize it as Romeo and Juliet. And you actually remember Romeo and Juliet, right? You read it in high school. But then as you're watching, you notice all these things that are different. Not only are the actors not really dressed like you expect the actors to look like, they might be moving in ways that seem cliched to you, but the music is samba music. It's this Latin music that you haven't heard before. And the story, if you remember, in the Shakespeare version of Romeo and Juliet, there's a rape that's alluded to in the middle of the play. In the West Side Story that appears on the Broadway stage, the rape occurs on stage. It's shocking. It's so shocking that the New York Times writes about it the next day. And then, at the end of Romeo and Juliet, the lovers die in each other's arms. This is probably all you really remember. At the end of West Side Story, the lovers come together and then the curtain comes down. Nobody dies. The audience doesn't even know that the play is over until the lights come up and they start to applaud. But when they applaud like crazy. West Side Story becomes the most important musical